The air in the prefect's antechamber tasted of polished chrome and recycled oxygen, a sterile palate cleanser for the soul. Elian stood with his spine perfectly straight, a millimeter of space between his back and the cool, unforgiving wall. He was a study in stillness, a carefully composed portrait of obedience. The gray tunic he wore was coarse, standardized, designed to negate the body within it. His hands were clasped behind his back, fingers locked so tightly the knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. He focused on the hum of the environmental controls, a low, constant thrum that was meant to be soothing but instead felt like a cage of sound. It was the only thing he allowed himself to focus on. To think of anything else was to invite chaos. To remember was to shatter. He was an asset. Designation Omega-734. His purpose was compliance. His existence was a carefully curated set of protocols. The scent suppressant patch on his neck was a cool chemical kiss, a constant reminder of the self that was not permitted to exist. It leached the ozone and petrichor from his blood, leaving only a neutral synthetic blankness in its wake. He was not a person. He was a function. The door slid open with a whisper of pressurized air, and Prefect Kalen entered. The atmosphere in the room immediately shifted, condensed, as if the very molecules of air had snapped to attention. Kalen was not a large man, but he occupied space with an absolute gravitational certainty. His uniform was the deep charcoal of a starless night, tailored with architectural precision. His face was a mask of calm authority, all sharp angles and controlled planes, his eyes the color of a winter storm. He did not look at Elian. Not at first. He moved to the obsidian desk that dominated the room, his movements economical and precise. A faint, almost imperceptible scent preceded him, vetiver and cold stone, the smell of order and unyielding structure. It was a scent that should have been reassuring, the olfactory signature of the system that kept everything in its place. For Elian, it was the scent of his own erasure. "Report," Kalen said, his voice a low baritone that matched the hum of the room. He was looking at a datapad, his attention seemingly elsewhere, but Elian knew better. The prefect's awareness was total, a panopticon from which nothing escaped. "Asset Omega-734, Elian began, his own voice a practiced monotone, stripped of inflection. "Ready for reassignment protocol. All biological markers are within acceptable parameters. Suppressant levels are optimal." Kalen made a small, dismissive gesture with his hand, not looking up. "Dispense with the formalities. 734. I have read the file. I am interested in the anomaly." The word hung in the air, anomaly, a polite term for the catastrophe that had occurred 72 hours ago. The system failure in the archival vault, the sudden catastrophic drop in atmospheric pressure that had triggered the emergency lockdown. And him. His own body, a traitorous vessel responding to the stress. The scent suppressant patch had failed, a flicker of malfunction in the face of overwhelming biological panic. His heat, suppressed for years under layers of chemical obedience, had torn through him like a flash flood. He remembered the heat, a blooming, agonizing fire behind his eyes. He remembered the scent of his own distress filling the confined space, thick and sweet with panic, rain after a lightning strike, terrified and raw. And he remembered the prefect, who had been in the vault with him, caught in the same steel trap. He remembered the shift in that cold, controlled scent, the vetiver sharpening, the stone heating as if from some subterranean fire. He remembered the darkness that had consumed the edges of his vision, the animal instinct that had screamed at him to find an anchor in the storm. He remembered the bite. The memory was a physical blow. He felt a phantom pressure on the scent gland at the juncture of his neck and shoulder, a sharp, possessive agony that had bloomed into something else entirely. Something terrifying and permanent. A bond, an accidental, horrific, unsanctioned bond. The suppressant malfunction was unforeseen, Elian said, the words tasting like ash. His control was fraying, the memory pulling at the threads of his composure. He could feel a faint echo of the prefect's scent, not just in the air, but inside his own mind, a ghost of vetiver clinging to his thoughts. It was a violation. Kalen finally looked up. His gray eyes were not accusatory. They were worse. They were analytical. He was observing a specimen, a problem to be solved. Unforeseen, he repeated, the word flat and devoid of emotion. He placed the datapad on the desk and walked toward Elian, his steps silent on the polished floor. He stopped a foot away, close enough that the air between them felt charged, electric. The bond is not unforeseen, it is a consequence, a deeply problematic one. He reached out, not to touch, but his fingers hovered near Elian's neck, near the place where a fresh medical seal now covered the mark. The medics have confirmed its integrity, a complete alpha-omega pairing, irrevocable without surgical intervention. Elian's breath hitched. Surgical intervention, the severing, a brutal invasive procedure that could leave an omega a neurological shell. But it was a way out. It was the only way out. I request the procedure, he said, his voice shaking for the first time. I formally request the severing. Kalen's hand dropped. He turned away, presenting Elian with the stark, unyielding line of his back. He walked to the wide viewport that looked out over the gridded, light-dusted expanse of the consortium sector. A city of perfect lines and perfect order. A city that had no place for anomalies. The request is denied. The words were quiet, but they landed, with the force of a physical impact. Elian felt the air leave his lungs. Denied? On what grounds? It was an accident, a malfunction. I am compromised. The asset is compromised. He used the language of the system, the only language the prefect understood. He tried to disconnect from the frantic, screaming thing inside him that was clawing at the walls of his ribs. You are not compromised, Kalen said, his gaze fixed on the city below. You are stabilized. Your biological markers since the incident have been, for the first time in your file's history, perfectly regulated. Your hormonal fluctuations have ceased. The latent stress indicators are gone. He turned his head slightly, his profile etched against the cold light of the city. The bond, however accidental, has rendered you a more stable asset. A cold dread, far worse than the panic in the vault, washed over Elian. He was a machine that had been broken, and in the process of breaking had inadvertently become more efficient. And the system did not discard efficient machines. So that is it, Elian whispered, the sound raw. I am to remain like this, tethered to you? The bond necessitates proximity, Kalen stated, as if discussing a logistical problem. Leaving it intact while maintaining distance would cause cascading biological degradation for both of us. It is inefficient. Therefore, you are being reassigned. Elian stared at his reflection in the polished black desk. A pale, haunted face. A stranger wearing his skin. Reassigned where? Kalen turned to face him fully, his expression unreadable, a placid sea over an unknowable depth. To my personal staff. You will be quartered in my residential sector. You will perform administrative duties. You will be under my direct and constant supervision. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the sterile air. The bond will be managed, contained, and you will continue to serve the consortium. That is all. It was not a reassignment. It was a life sentence, a gilded cage where the bars were made of an invisible, biological chain. Elian felt the last vestiges of his carefully constructed neutrality crumble, replaced by a surge of desperate, defiant terror. He looked at the prefect, at the calm, calculating man who was now his keeper, his anchor, the other half of a soul-deep connection he had never wanted. He was an asset. He was an experiment. He was a problem that had been given a new, more efficient solution. And as he stood there, trapped in the prefect's gaze, a single rebellious thought broke through the years of conditioning. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a prisoner. And he would find a way out. The transfer to the prefect's residential sector was a study in silent efficiency. 2 guards, their faces obscured by helmets, their forms bulky in standard-issue gray armor, flanked him as he walked through corridors that grew progressively less utilitarian. The recycled air began to smell cleaner, tinged with a faint, almost subliminal trace of something organic, something that might have once been a plant. The walls shifted from bare plasteel to panels of dark, polished wood. The lighting softened from a harsh, clinical glare to a warm, ambient glow. It was designed to be calming, a sanctuary of power and privilege. To Elian, it felt like the meticulous design of a more elaborate prison. His worldly possessions fit into a single small crate, 3 spare tunics, a block of nutrient paste, a datapad containing only consortium-approved texts, and a small, smooth riverstone he had kept hidden for years, a relic from a life he could barely remember. A life before he was Omega 734. The guards left him at the entrance to Kalen's private quarters. The door slid open, revealing a space that was vast, minimalist, and suffocatingly quiet. The main room was dominated by a floor-to-ceiling viewport, the same one from the prefect's office, showcasing the sprawling, indifferent city. The furniture was sparse and angular, a low-slung sofa in black leather, a table of smoked glass, shelves that held not books, but crystalline data shards, neatly arranged. Everything was black, gray, or chrome. It was the physical manifestation of the prefect himself, ordered, severe, and emotionally barren. And his scent was everywhere, not overpowering, but a constant ambient presence. Vetiver and stone woven into the very fabric of the air, the furniture, the silence. For a bonded Omega, it should have been comforting, a biological imperative fulfilled. For Elian, it was a constant low-grade torment, a reminder of the chain wrapped around his soul. His own room was an alcove off the main living area, separated by a sliding panel. It was small, containing only a sleeping platform, a small workstation, and a sanitation unit. It was larger and more private than the barracks he was used to, but the lack of a proper door felt deliberate. He was accessible, always. He placed his crate on the floor and ran a hand over the smooth, cool surface of the river stone. It was a foolish, sentimental thing to keep, a liability. But it was the only thing in his life that was truly his. He had found it in a reclamation yard, a place where the discarded pieces of the pre-consortium world were processed into raw materials. It was a tiny piece of chaos, of nature, in a world of perfect, manufactured order. He spent the first cycle in a state of suspended animation. He followed the schedule uploaded to his datapad with robotic precision. Wake at 0600. Consume nutrient ration. Report to the prefect's home office, a sterile, paperless space adjoining the main room. He was tasked with organizing and cross-referencing logistical reports from the outer sectors. The work was tedious, requiring immense focus, which was, he suspected, the point. Keep the asset occupied. He worked in silence. Kalen was often there, working at his own terminal, a silent, formidable presence. He rarely spoke to Elian directly, instead sending instructions via text comms, even when they were only meters apart. The silence was a weapon, a tool of control. It forced Elian inward, into the buzzing, chaotic hive of his own thoughts, where the bond was a constant, shimmering hum beneath the surface of his consciousness. It was a strange, disorienting existence. He was closer to an alpha than any unbonded Omega was ever permitted to be, yet the distance between them felt galactic. The bond was a physical reality, a thrumming, living thing, At odd moments, he would feel a flicker of an emotion that was not his own. A sharp spike of frustration when a data stream corrupted on Kalen's terminal, a fleeting sense of satisfaction when a complex problem was resolved. He felt the echo of the Alpha's mental state, a low tide of focused concentration, of tightly controlled stress. It was an intimacy more profound than any touch, and it was utterly devoid of warmth. He learned to build walls in his own mind, to recognize the foreign intrusions and push them away, but it was exhausting. It was like trying to hold back the ocean with his bare hands. One evening, Kalen was late. The city lights had ignited outside the viewport, a cold, glittering tapestry. Elian had finished his assigned tasks hours ago, but had not been dismissed. Protocol dictated he wait. He stood by the viewport, his gaze lost in the geometric precision of the world below. He felt a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar in his chest. It was not his own emotion. It was a spike of acute, piercing pain, followed by a wave of cold fury. It was Kalen's. The bond was a conduit, and somewhere in the city, the prefect was in distress. The feeling was so strong it made Elian gasp, his hand flying to his chest. The pain was in his own shoulder, a sympathetic, ghostly agony. The door to the quarters slid open. Kalen entered, and for the first time his mask of control was fractured. There was a slight limp in his stride, a tightness around his mouth. His left arm was held stiffly at his side. The scent of vetiver was sharp, acrid, laced with the metallic tang of blood. Elian did not think. He moved. The years of conditioning screamed at him to remain still, to await orders, but a deeper, more primal instinct took over. The bond was screaming. His alpha was hurt. The thought was horrifying, but the instinct was undeniable. He met Kalen in the center of the room. "You're injured," he said, the words coming out breathless. Kalen stopped, his gray eyes widening almost imperceptibly. He looked down at Elian, not as a prefect looking at an asset, but as something else. Something surprised. "It is a minor disciplinary matter," he said, his voice strained. "A security exercise. Return to your duties." But Elian could see the dark stains spreading on the charcoal fabric of his uniform. Just below the shoulder, he could feel the throb of the wound as if it were his own. "You're bleeding," he insisted, his voice quiet but firm. "The medical kit is in the sanitation unit." For a long moment they stood in silence, locked in a strange tableau. The controlled Alpha and the compliant Omega, their roles suddenly terrifyingly blurred. The air crackled with the unspoken reality of the bond. Kalen's control was predicated on distance, on protocol. Elian's proximity, his genuine instinctual concern, was a variable Kalen had not anticipated. Finally, with a barely audible sigh of resignation, Kalen nodded. "Very well." In the stark white light of the sanitation unit, the injury was worse than Elian had imagined. A deep laceration, likely from a plasma baton, sizzled at the edges. It was a training wound designed to hurt but not maim, but it had been delivered with force. Kalen sat on a bench, his jacket removed, his back rigid. Elian worked with a detached efficiency he didn't know he possessed, cleaning the wound, applying a dermal regenerator. His hands were steady, his movements precise. He did not allow himself to think about what he was doing, touching the prefect, tending to him. He focused on the task, the clinical application of medical procedure. But he could feel the tension radiating from Kalen's body, the tightly coiled anger. And beneath the anger, something else. A flicker of something. It was not pain, it was not surprise. It was a deep, resonant confusion. As Elian applied the final sterile bandage, his fingers brushed against the uninjured skin of Kalen's shoulder. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through both of them. A spark jumped across the bond, a flare of pure, unfiltered sensation. Elian saw a flash of an image in his mind's eye, A training room, the smell of ozone, the face of another alpha. Sneering. He felt a surge of Kalen's cold, controlled rage, the desire to dominate, to win, to prove. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. Elian pulled his hand back as if burned, his heart hammering in his chest. Kalen went utterly still, his back muscles bunching under the thin fabric of his undershirt. The silence in the small room was absolute, broken only by the sound of their breathing. "The procedure is complete," Elian said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He retreated, putting distance between them, his back hitting the cool wall. Kalen stood slowly, rotating his injured shoulder. He did not look at Elian. He looked at his own reflection in the mirrored cabinet, but his gaze was distant, unfocused. He seemed to be looking at a stranger. "Your efficiency is noted 734, he said, the formality returning, a shield being raised. "You are dismissed for the cycle." Elian fled to his alcove, the sliding panel closing behind him like a portcullis. He sank onto his sleeping platform, his body trembling. He had crossed a line. He had touched the untouchable. He had felt the prefect's inner world, and the prefect had felt him feeling it. The bond was not just a chain. It was a two-way mirror, and the glass had just cracked. He curled into a ball, clutching the smooth, cold river stone in his hand. The vetiver and stone scent of the alpha was now joined by something else. Something he had put there himself, the clean antiseptic smell of the medical supplies. He had marked the alpha's territory. He had marked the alpha. And in the oppressive silence of his new cage, he did not know whether that was an act of submission or an act of war. The incident with the injury created a subtle but seismic shift in the dynamic between them. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with the memory of that shared moment of vulnerability. Kalen's control seemed, if possible, even more rigid. He avoided any proximity that was not strictly necessary. His instructions delivered exclusively through the terminal, his physical presence a study in deliberate distance. Yet Elian could feel the change through the bond. The steady, low hum of Kalen's focused mind was now frequently disrupted by sharp, discordant notes of something akin to frustration, a kind of internal static he couldn't quite decipher. It was as if a perfectly calibrated machine had developed a persistent, irritating glitch. Elian, for his part, found a strange, dangerous confidence blooming in the barren soil of his existence. The bond was a prison, yes, but it was also a source of information. He was no longer just a subject under observation. He was an observer himself. He could feel the subtle shifts in Kalen's emotional state, the tightening of his focus when reviewing sensitive reports, the almost imperceptible relaxation when he would stare out at the city lights, late at night, believing himself to be alone. Elian learned to shield his own thoughts more effectively, to present a placid surface while his mind was a whirlwind of observation and analysis. He was learning his captor. His duties remained the same, mind-numbing, repetitive data collation. But he started to see patterns. He was handling logistics for Sector Gamma 9, a resource-rich but historically unstable region. He saw supply requisitions that were consistently altered, production reports that were subtly inflated. Small discrepancies, the kind that would be dismissed as clerical errors by a cursory glance, but when viewed as a whole, they painted a picture of systemic deception. Someone was skimming resources from Gamma 9. It was a dangerous piece of knowledge, a secret hidden in plain sight within the endless streams of data. He did not know what to do with it, but the knowledge itself was a weight, a new kind of currency. One cycle, a message appeared on his private terminal. It was not from Kalen. It was an encrypted, anonymous comm. "The garden is dying, the roots are poisoned." It was a simple, coded phrase, but Elian understood it instantly. It was a line from a pre-consortium poem, a forbidden text he had once stumbled upon in a corrupted data file. It was a phrase used by dissenters, a whisper of rebellion in the heart of the machine. The message was followed by a single data packet. He hesitated for a full minute, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Opening it was an act of treason. Ignoring it felt like a betrayal of the small, flickering hope the message had ignited. With a trembling finger, he activated the file. It was a medical report. Anonymized, but the biological markers were unmistakable. It detailed the long-term effects of the standard-issue omega suppressant: neurological degradation, cellular decay, a significantly reduced lifespan. The consortium wasn't just controlling its omegas, it was slowly, systematically poisoning them. The suppressants that were supposed to be a tool of stability were in fact a weapon of managed extinction. The blank, neutral scent the patch enforced was the smell of a slow, creeping death. A wave of cold nausea washed over him. He thought of the thousands of omegas like him, their bodies silently breaking down under the guise of care and control. He thought of his own file, which Kalen had commented on. Your biological markers since the incident have been, for the first time in your file's history, perfectly regulated. The bond. The accidental, horrifying bond to an alpha had somehow counteracted the effects of the poison. It had stabilized him. It had, in a cruel twist of irony, saved his life, even as it had stolen his freedom. He looked up from the terminal, his gaze drawn toward Kalen's office. The prefect was in there, a silhouette against the glowing screens. The man who was the embodiment of the system. Did he know? Was he a willing participant in this silent genocide, or was he just another cog, blind to the true nature of the machine he served? The bond gave him no answer. Kalen's mind was a fortress. His surface thoughts a disciplined march of logistics and security protocols. The truth, if it existed, was buried too deep. Elian deleted the file, scrubbing every trace of it from his terminal. But the information was branded onto his mind. The river stone in his pocket suddenly felt heavier. It was a piece of the real world, the world the consortium was trying to pave over and forget. And he, an anomaly, a bonded asset, was now a keeper of a truth that could bring the entire structure of their society crashing down. His personal desire for freedom suddenly felt small, selfish. This was bigger than him. That night, sleep offered no escape. He was plagued by nightmares, fragmented images of dying gardens and weeping stones. He woke up gasping, his body slick with a cold sweat. The scent of his own distress filled his small alcove, ozone and fear. And then he felt a response. Through the bond, he felt a surge of alarm from the other room. Kalen was awake. He could feel the Alpha's sudden, sharp focus directed entirely at him. He heard a soft footstep in the main room. The panel to his alcove slid open. Kalen stood in the doorway, a tall, dark shape, against the faint light from the main room. He was wearing simple, dark sleep trousers, his chest bare. In the dimness, stripped of his uniform and his authority, he looked younger, more uncertain. "You are in distress," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a diagnosis. Elian sat up, pulling his knees to his chest, trying to make himself smaller. He tried to rein in his scent, to force down the panic, but his body would not obey. "A nightmare," he managed to say, his voice rough. Kalen did not move from the doorway. He simply watched, his gray eyes seeming to absorb the faint light, glowing with a strange intensity. "The bond transmits acute emotional spikes," he said, his voice low, almost conversational. "Your fear is palpable." "I apologize for the disturbance," Elian said, the words automatic, the conditioned response of an asset who had malfunctioned. "It is not a disturbance," Kalen replied, and there was a strange, rough edge to his voice. "It is a data point." He took a step into the room and then another. He stopped beside the sleeping platform. The proximity was overwhelming. His scent, free from the crisp formality of his uniform, was deeper, muskier. The smell of vetiver was still there, but it was intertwined with the warm, living scent of his skin. It was intoxicating and terrifying. It called to something primal in Elian, something the suppressants had never truly been able to kill. "What did you dream of?" Elian shook his head, looking down at his hands. "It doesn't matter." "It does," Kalen insisted. He sat on the edge of the platform. The movement was so unexpected, so contrary to every protocol that Elian flinched. The mattress dipped with his weight, and Elian felt the warmth of his body through the thin fabric of his tunic. "The integrity of this bond is now a matter of my own stability as well as yours. Your distress becomes my distraction. It is an inefficiency I must understand in order to manage it." He was still talking like a technician diagnosing a fault in a machine, but his presence, his nearness, was anything but clinical. Elian could feel the conflict in him, the rigid adherence to logic warring with an instinct he probably didn't even have a name for. The alpha instinct to soothe the distressed Omega, to protect. Summoning a courage he didn't know he possessed, Elian looked up and met Kalen's gaze. "I dreamt the truth," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I dreamt of the poison we are all forced to drink, the one you call a cure." Kalen's expression did not change, but Elian felt it through the bond. A sudden, sharp, cold shock. A wall slamming down in his mind. He had struck a nerve. A deep one. "You will explain that statement," Kalen said, his voice losing all its warmth, becoming the flat, dangerous tone of the prefect. "The suppressants," Elian said, the words tumbling out. "They cause neurological decay. They are killing us, slowly, and you know it. The consortium knows it." He wasn't sure if it was an accusation or a plea. He was showing his hand, revealing the dangerous knowledge he possessed. It was a gamble that could get him sent to reconditioning, or worse. Kalen stared at him, his face a mask of stone. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Elian's heart hammered, waiting for the verdict. He had expected denial. He had expected anger. He did not expect the quiet, weary resignation that finally settled in Kalen's eyes. "Not all of us know," Kalen said, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the hum of the ventilation. He looked away, his gaze fixing on the far wall. "The data is classified at the highest levels. It is deemed a necessary cost for societal stability." A necessary cost. The casual cruelty of the phrase stole Elian's breath. They knew, and they did nothing. "A necessary cost," he whispered, his voice trembling with a rage that was cold and pure. "We are not numbers on a balance sheet. We are people." "To the consortium, you are assets," Kalen said, the words sounding hollow, as if he were reciting a doctrine he no longer believed. He finally looked back at Elian, and for the first time, the mask was gone. In its place was a profound, aching weariness, a deep, old wound. "I was an asset once, too." The confession hung in the air between them, a revelation so startling it seemed to alter the very fabric of the room. Kalen, the perfect alpha, the embodiment of the system, had once been on the other side of the equation. "My designation was Alpha 217, he continued, his voice a low murmur. "I was part of a program, an experiment to create more effective alphas, more controlled, less susceptible to instinct." He gestured vaguely at his own chest. "They succeeded, for the most part." Elian stared at him, seeing him for the first time, not as a prefect, not as his captor, but as another product of the same brutal system. A different kind of cage, but a cage nonetheless. The control was not his nature. It had been programmed into him. The coldness was a scar. "The bond," Kalen said, looking down at his own hands as if they were foreign objects. "It bypasses the conditioning. It forces a connection that my training was designed to prevent. When you feel distress, I feel it, not as an idea, but as a physical sensation. It is disruptive. He looked at Elian, and his gray eyes were filled with a raw, painful confusion. When I denied your request to sever the bond, it was because protocol dictated that a stable asset was of primary importance. That was the logic. That was the truth. He paused. I am no longer certain it is the only truth. In that moment, lying in the darkness of his small cell, Elian understood. Kalen hadn't kept him as a prisoner out of cruelty or a desire for possession. He had done it because it was the only logical solution presented by his programming. But now the bond was forcing a new logic upon him, an emotional logic. The glitch Elian had felt in him was his own buried humanity, fighting its way to the surface. He didn't know what to say. The chasm between them was still immense, littered with years of pain and conditioning. But for the first time, a bridge had appeared. Fragile and tenuous, but there. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them. He did not touch him. It was simply an offer, a gesture. Kalen looked at his hand, then back at his face. The battle in his eyes was stark and painful to witness. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised his own hand and placed it over Elian's, his fingers gently engulfing his. The skin-on-skin contact was electric. A current flowed through the bond, not of images or sharp emotions, but of something quieter, a shared sense of stillness, a mutual acknowledgement of the cage they were both in. His hand was warm, the first truly warm thing Elian had felt in years. And in the shared silence, surrounded by the cold architecture of the consortium, a new and terrifying possibility began to take root in Elian's heart. Hope. The aftermath of Kalen's confession was a period of fragile, unspoken truce. The walls between them, both literal and metaphorical, remained, but they had become porous. Kalen resumed his duties with the same outward composure, the prefect's mask sliding back into place the moment the sun rose. But Elian could feel the difference. The internal static he had once sensed in the Alpha had coalesced into a low, thrumming frequency of conflict. He was a man at war with his own programming. He started leaving his office door open. He would occasionally ask Elian for his assessment on a dataset, a subtle but significant shift from issuing commands. He was treating him less like an asset and more like a colleague, an unwilling, imprisoned colleague, but a colleague nonetheless. Elian, meanwhile, used this new tentative space to push the boundaries. He began his own quiet investigation, using his access to the logistical data streams to trace the source of the doctored reports from Sector Gamma 9. It was a dangerous game. If Kalen discovered what he was doing, he could be sent for reconditioning without a second thought. But the knowledge of the suppressants had ignited a cold fire in him. He was no longer just fighting for his own freedom. He was fighting for the silent, dying population of Omegas who didn't even know they were condemned. He worked late into the cycles, long after Kalen had retired to his room. The bond was a strange and useful tool in this endeavor. It acted as an early warning system. He could feel the moment Kalen's consciousness began to drift toward sleep, the moment his mental fortress was at its least guarded. He could also feel when the Alpha was restless, and on those nights he would cease his work, presenting the image of a perfectly compliant asset. One night he found it. A single heavily encrypted transaction log buried under layers of phantom data. It detailed a series of unauthorized shipments of raw materials, the very ones being skimmed from Gamma 9, rerouted to a decommissioned medical facility in the underlevels of the sector. The authorization code belonged to a senior administrator named Jorik, a man whose name Elian had seen on several high-level security briefs, but the final signatory for the sector's overall budget was Prefect Kalen himself. His digital signature was on every doctored summary report. He was either complicit, willfully blind, or being masterfully deceived. Elian's heart sank. The easiest, most logical explanation was the first. He saved a copy of the log to his Riverstone, which he had modified with a microport, a piece of contraband technology he had acquired years ago. The stone was now his only insurance policy. As he was closing the file, he felt a sudden, sharp spike of alarm through the bond. Kalen was awake, and he was coming. Elian barely had time to wipe the terminal and assume a neutral posture before the door to the office slid open. Kalen stood there, not in his sleep clothes, but fully dressed in his uniform, his face grim. "There has been a security alert," he said. His voice clipped. "An unauthorized data access attempt on the Gamma-9 servers. From this sector." He walked to Elian's terminal, his presence radiating a cold, lethal authority. Elian's blood ran cold. He had been too careless. He had tripped an alarm. "My terminal has been idle for the past hour," Elian said, his voice perfectly steady, a feat of immense control. He met Kalen's gaze without flinching. "I was reviewing the day's intake logs, as per your instructions." Kalen stared at him, his gray eyes narrowed, searching. Elian could feel the pressure of the Alpha's suspicion through the bond, a cold, probing force. He focused on building his mental walls, brick by brick, projecting an image of calm, innocent compliance. It was the performance of his life. For a long, agonizing moment, Kalen just stood there, the silence stretching to a breaking point. Elian could feel the Alpha's internal debate, the evidence of the security alert versus the placid surface presented by the Omega he was bonded to, the machine versus the man. Finally, Kalen turned away. The alert was likely a system echo, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "But security protocols must be observed. I will be placing a temporary lockdown on all outbound data traffic from this residence." He looked back at Elian, his expression unreadable. "You will confine yourself to your quarters until further notice." It was a test, a quarantine. He was a suspect. As Elian walked back to his alcove, he could feel Kalen's eyes on him, a weight on his back. The trust, or whatever fragile thing had been growing between them, had been shattered. He was once again the asset, the potential threat. The panel slid shut, and he was alone with the damning evidence in his pocket and the cold certainty that the walls were closing in. For 2 full cycles, Elian was confined to his room. Nutrient paste was delivered through a slot in the wall. He had no access to a terminal, no contact with the outside world. He was completely isolated, left alone with the hum of the ventilation and the ever-present watchful sense of Kalen on the other side of the wall. The bond had become a torment. It broadcast Kalen's suspicion and his own tightly controlled frustration in a feedback loop of misery. Elian felt like a caged animal pacing the small space, the Riverstone a cold, heavy weight in his hand. He had the truth, but he was trapped, unable to use it. On the 3rd cycle, the panel slid open. Kalen stood there, looking haggard. There were dark circles under his eyes, and the lines on his face seemed deeper. The bond felt frayed, stretched thin with stress and lack of sleep. "Come with me," he said, his voice flat. He led Elian not to the office, but to the main living area. On the large viewing screen, a face was displayed. Senior Administrator Jorik. He was smiling, a bland corporate smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a recorded message, a sector-wide broadcast. He was announcing his promotion to Deputy Prefect, citing his unwavering commitment to consortium efficiency and security. Jorik tripped his own security alert, Kalen said, his voice a low growl. He was staring at the screen with an expression of pure, cold loathing. "He did it to draw my attention to see how I would react. It was a power play." He turned to Elian, his gray eyes burning with a new, dangerous light. "He has been my rival for years. I always suspected he was corrupt, but he was too careful. He never left a trail." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "Until now. The alert you triggered was just noisy enough to make him nervous, to make him accelerate his plans, and just quiet enough that I was the only one who registered it as a genuine threat. He doesn't know that I know. Elian's mind raced. Kalen knew he had been on the servers. He had known all along. The lockdown wasn't a punishment, it was a protection. He was protecting Elian from Jorik's notice. "You knew it was me," Elian whispered. "I felt it," Kalen corrected him, a hand going to his own chest. "I felt your focus, your determination. It is a very distinct emotional signature." He walked over to the viewport, looking down at the city. "I ran my own deep-level diagnostic after I confined you. I found the traces of your search, and I found the transaction log you copied." He turned back, his face a grim mask. "Jorik isn't just skimming resources. The decommissioned medical facility he's supplying, it's a lab. He is weaponizing the neurological decay caused by the suppressants. He's developing a targeted airborne agent that can accelerate the process to be used as a method of crowd control, a way to pacify entire sectors of Omegas without a single shot fired." The horror of it was absolute. It was a new level of monstrousness. Jorik wasn't just a thief. He was a monster, building a weapon of mass destruction aimed at his own people. "He is making his move for my position," Kalen continued, his voice tight with controlled rage. "The promotion is the first step. He will use his new authority to bury his project so deep no one will ever find it. He needs me out of the way, discredited, or removed." Suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place. The security exercise where Kalen was injured. It wasn't just a training exercise. It was likely an assassination attempt, disguised and deniable. Jorik was playing for keeps. "Why are you telling me this?" Elian asked, his heart pounding. This was beyond anything he had imagined. He was a data clerk, an asset. This was the world of alphas and power struggles. Kalen walked toward him, stopping just a few feet away. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. "Because you are the only one I can trust," he said, the admission seeming to cost him a great deal. "You are bonded to me. Your survival is intrinsically linked to my own. That is a loyalty Jorik cannot buy and cannot threaten." He looked at Elian, his gaze direct and piercing. "And because you were right. The system I have served my entire life is built on a foundation of poison and lies. Jorik is not an aberration. He is the system's logical conclusion, and I will not be a part of it any longer." It was a declaration of war, a quiet, personal rebellion declared in the sterile silence of his apartment. He was choosing a side. He was choosing Elian's side. "Jorik has a weakness," Kalen said, his mind clearly already working on strategy. "He is arrogant. He keeps a private hard copy ledger of all his transactions, a personal failsafe. I know he keeps it in his office safe in the sector administration tower. The data on your stone is enough to raise suspicion, but the ledger is undeniable proof. It would be enough to have him executed." "His office will be the most secure location in the sector," Elian stated, the impossibility of the task dawning on him. "It is," Kalen agreed, "but its security system has one vulnerability. It is keyed to the biometric signature of the sector's prefect." He held up his hand. hand, my eye, my scent. The system is designed so that the prefect has absolute oversight." He lowered his hand, his expression grim. "But I cannot go myself. Jorik is watching my every move. The moment I step foot in the administration tower outside of a scheduled meeting, he will know. He will wipe the data, and I will have lost my only chance." Elian saw the path laid out before him, a dark, terrifying road. "You want me to go?" "I want us to go," Kalen corrected him. "The security system requires my biometric data, but the system can be fooled. The bond between us, it's more than just an emotional link. There is a physiological component. Our scents have begun to mirror each other. Your pheromonal signature is now close enough to mine that with a masking agent, you could fool the olfactory sensors for a short period. The palm scanner and retinal scanner can be bypassed with high-fidelity clones I can create in my workshop. He was speaking quickly now, the plan forming in his mind. You can get in, you can retrieve the ledger. I can monitor you from here using the bond as a proximity sensor and communication device. I can guide you. It was insane. It was a suicide mission. Elian was a clerk, not a spy. But as he looked at Kalen, at the desperate, defiant hope in the Alpha's eyes, he knew he had no other choice. This was it. The chance to not just free himself, but to tear down the whole rotten structure, to avenge the countless Omegas who had been condemned to a slow death. "When do we do this?" Elian asked, his voice quiet but firm. A faint ghost of a smile touched Kalen's lips. It was the first time Elian had ever seen him smile. It transformed his face, chasing away some of the shadows. "Tonight," he said. "During the sector's energy rationing cycle, most of the tower will be on low power with only a skeleton crew of guards." He stepped closer, his gaze locking with Elian's. "There is no margin for error. If you are caught—" "I know," Elian said, cutting him off. He knew the price of failure, reconditioning, a living death. He reached into his pocket and closed his hand around the river stone. The smooth, solid weight of it was a comfort, a connection to a world of real things. He was done being a ghost in the machine. Tonight he would become a wrench in its gears. The hours leading up to the infiltration were a blur of tense, focused preparation. Kalen's private workshop, a room Elian had never been permitted to enter, was a stark contrast to the rest of his quarters. It was a space of controlled chaos, filled with diagnostic tools, fabrication units, and disassembled electronics. Here the prefect's mask of detached authority was replaced by the intense concentration of an engineer. He worked with a swift, silent precision, fabricating a thin, flexible glove with a perfect replica of his palm print embedded in the silicone. He created a contact lens that would project his retinal scan. The final piece of the puzzle was the scent masker. It wasn't a suppressor, but a catalytic agent that Elian would apply to his own scent glands. It would react with his pheromones, amplifying the mirrored elements of Kalen's scent and temporarily overriding his own. "It will only last for 1 hour precisely," Kalen warned, holding the small vial of clear liquid. "After that, it will degrade rapidly, and your own scent will become dominant. You must be out of the tower by then." Elian nodded, his mouth dry. He was dressed in a dark, non-reflective maintenance uniform, the hood pulled low to shadow his face. He felt a strange sense of calm settling over him, the calm that comes after fear has been exhausted. He was no longer Omega 734, the compliant asset. He was an agent of chaos, a walking, breathing anomaly. Kalen finished the preparations, laying out the tools on a workbench. The glove, the lens, the vial, a small data spike for disabling security cameras, and a compact high-frequency sonic emitter capable of disorienting guards at close range. "This is for emergencies only," Kalen said, his hand hovering over the emitter. "Its use will trigger an immediate high-level alert. You will have seconds to escape." As Elian reached for the equipment, Kalen's hand closed over his wrist. His grip was firm, his skin warm. "Elian," he said. It was the first time he had ever used his name. The sound of it, in his low, serious voice, was a physical shock. It made him real. "Listen to me," Kalen continued, his gray eyes intense. "Once you are inside, I will have no way to help you physically, but I will be with you." He tapped his own temple. "Through this, focus on my presence. I will guide you through the corridors. I can feel the security patrols through the building's network. I can feel where they are. Let me be your eyes and ears." Elian looked at their joined hands. The bond, the chain that had been his prison, was now being offered as his greatest weapon. The irony was not lost on him. He gave a single sharp nod. Kalen released his wrist but did not step back. An awkward, heavy silence fell between them. There were 1,000 things that could be said, 1,000 emotions swirling in the charged air. But they were men forged in a system that punished emotion, that had no language for what was happening between them. So Kalen did the only thing his programming would allow. He fell back on protocol, but it was a new protocol, one he was writing for just the two of them. He reached out and gently adjusted the collar of Elian's uniform, a gesture that was both practical and achingly tender. "Be careful," he whispered, the words a raw, unguarded plea. The journey to the administration tower was a ghost-like passage through the sector's service tunnels. The energy rationing cycle had plunged the city into a state of semi-darkness, the towering buildings reduced to skeletal silhouettes against the polluted glow of the upper atmosphere. Elian moved with a stealth he hadn't known he possessed, Kalen's voice a low, steady murmur, not in his ear but in his mind. A left turn here, a maintenance ladder. Avoid the south corridor, a patrol is approaching. It was a disorienting, intimate form of guidance. He felt Kalen's focused calm like a shield around him, a buffer against the fear that gnawed at the edges of his resolve. The tower loomed before him, a black spear piercing the sky. He entered through a sub-level thermal exhaust port, the schematics for which Kalen had projected directly into his mind's eye. Inside, the air was cold and still. Emergency lighting cast long, distorted shadows down the empty corridors. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own soft-soled boots on the polished floor. He reached the executive levels. The first security checkpoint was a biometric scanner. He took a deep breath, the scent of the masking agent, a sharp, sterile smell filling his nostrils. He placed the gloved hand on the panel. A green light flickered. Access granted. The retinal scanner was next. He stared into the red beam, the contact lens doing its work. Access granted. The final test was the olfactory sensor, a near-invisible port that sampled the air. He held his breath, praying the masker was holding. After a heart-stopping second, the heavy door before him slid open with a soft hiss. He was in. Jorik's office was at the end of the hall. It was ostentatious, larger than Kalen's, filled with rare artifacts from pre-consortium excavations. It was the office of a man who enjoyed power, who liked to display it. The safe was hidden behind a large, abstract painting, just as Kalen had predicted. Elian worked quickly, using the data spike to create a temporary loop in the office's internal camera feed. He approached the safe. It required the same 3 biometric markers: hand, eye, scent. He repeated the process, his heart hammering against his ribs. The safe door clicked open. Inside, among stacks of illicit credit chips and personal data shards, was a single leather-bound book, the ledger. It felt heavy in his hands, a physical object in a world of digital ghosts. He had it. A surge of triumph, sharp and bright, shot through him. He felt an echo of it from Kalen through the bond, a wave of profound relief. Time to go. He slipped the ledger into a hidden pocket in his uniform and turned to leave. And then he froze. The scent masker was failing. He could smell it, the sharp, sterile scent giving way to the first faint traces of his own terrified pheromones, ozone and rain. The hour was up. He had taken too long. A new scent hit the air. Not his, not Kalen's. Something else. Bitter, like burnt almonds. And it was coming from the vent above the door. An alarm. A silent, chemical alarm. Jorik had a personal security measure, one not on any official schematic. The door to the office slid open. Administrator Jorik stood there, flanked by 2 heavily armed guards. He was smiling, that same bland, empty smile from the broadcast, but his eyes were cold, dead things. "Omega 734, he said, his voice smooth as oil. The prefect's new pet. I must admit I didn't think he had it in him to be so creative. He looked from Elian to the open safe. But sending you to do his dirty work? That's just sloppy. Elian's mind raced. Kalen's voice was a frantic shout in his head. The emitter. Use the emitter. Now. But Elian knew it was too late. Using the emitter would trigger a sector-wide alarm. He would never make it out of the building. He was trapped. But he had the ledger. The proof. Jorik took a step into the room. Give me the book, Omega, and I might persuade the consortium to simply have you reconditioned. A clean slate. You'll be much happier, I assure you. Elian clutched the ledger to his chest. He looked Jorik in the eye, and for the first time in his life, he did not feel like an asset. He did not feel like a victim. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated defiance. He thought of the dying Omegas. He thought of Kalen fighting his own war from afar. He would not fail them. He took a step back toward the massive viewport that made up the far wall of the office. The city glittered below, 1,000 feet down. Kalen's voice in his head was a roar of panic. No, Elian, don't! The book goes with me, Elian said, his voice ringing with a clarity that surprised him. Yorik's smile faded. You are a fool. There is no escape. There is always an escape, Elian whispered. He took one last look at Yorik's shocked face. Then he spun around, raised his foot, and kicked with all his strength against the delicate crystalline data shard display next to the window. The shards, containing Jorik's private, incriminating data, flew into the air. In the split second of distraction as Jorik and the guards instinctively flinched from the shattering crystal, Elian did the unthinkable. He ran straight at the viewport. The reinforced plasteel was designed to withstand immense pressure, but it was not designed for a direct, focused impact from a sonic emitter. He activated it just as he hit the glass. The high-frequency blast, combined with his body weight, was just enough. The viewport didn't shatter. It cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading from the point of impact. And then with a deafening groan, the entire panel gave way. For a single silent moment, he was suspended in the air, the wind screaming around him. The city lights rushed up to meet him. In his mind, he felt a single, pure, agonized scream of his name from Kalen. And then he fell. The fall was not a terrifying void, but a rush of sensory overload. The wind was a physical force, tearing at his uniform, screaming in his ears. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. He clutched the ledger to his chest, his one and only purpose. In his mind, the bond was a raw, open wound, flooding with Kalen's agony, his despair, his helpless rage. It was a pain more profound than any physical impact could be. He closed his eyes, bracing for the end, his last thought a strange sense of peace. He had made a choice. He was free. But the end did not come. Instead, there was a violent, bone-jarring jerk. His descent slowed with brutal, neck-snapping force. He was caught. He opened his eyes, gasping. A transport shuttle, small and unmarked, hovered beside him, its grav lifts whining at maximum output. The side door was open and a figure was leaning out, a magnetic tether in his hand, the other end of which was now clamped to the back of Elian's uniform. The figure was Kalen. His face was a mask of raw, desperate fury and terror. The prefect's control was gone, burned away by a pure, primal fear. He hauled Elian into the shuttle, the magnetic tether disengaging with a loud clank. Elian collapsed onto the floor of the vehicle, his body screaming in protest from the sudden deceleration. Kalen slammed the door shut and threw the shuttle into a steep, reckless climb, weaving through the transport lanes with a pilot's skill Elian never would have imagined. "What were you thinking?" Kalen roared, his voice breaking. He wasn't looking at Elian, his hands gripping the controls so tightly his knuckles were white. He was navigating the cityscape with a suicidal abandon, pushing the small craft to its limits. Elian pushed himself up, his limbs trembling. He held up the ledger. "I was thinking," he said, his voice hoarse, "that this was more important than me." Kalen risked a single fleeting glance at him. The look in his eyes was something Elian had never seen before. It was not the gaze of a prefect or a handler. It was the look of a man who had just witnessed the most precious thing in his world almost being destroyed. "You are an idiot," Kalen said, but the words had no heat. They were filled with a profound, ragged relief. He looked back at the controls, his jaw tight. "They will have the entire sector on lockdown within minutes. Every transport is being scanned. We can't stay here." He banked the shuttle hard, diving into the lower levels, the glittering spires of the upper city replaced by a labyrinth of pipes, steam vents, and darkened industrial structures. He was flying blind, relying on instinct and a deep intrinsic knowledge of the city's forgotten pathways. Elian could feel the city coming alive behind them. He could sense the wave of alarm spreading through the security networks, a psychic scream that Kalen was also feeling through his connection to the system. Red and blue lights began to strobe in the canyons below, the first signs of the search patrols. "Where are we going?" Elian asked, pulling himself into the co-pilot seat. "There's a place," Kalen said, his focus absolute. "A dead zone, an old abandoned subway nexus from before the consortium. The network scans can't penetrate that deep. It will buy us time." He navigated the shuttle through an impossibly narrow gap between two massive support pylons, the wings of the craft scraping against the metal with a screech of protest. "Jorik will assume you died in the fall. He will report you as a casualty of a failed infiltration attempt. He will use it to discredit me, to paint me as unstable, reckless. He will take my position. He will control the narrative." "But we have the proof," Elian insisted, clutching the ledger. "The proof is useless if we are dead or captured," Kalen countered, his voice grim. "The consortium will not investigate its own. They will bury it. They will bury us. Our only chance is to get this ledger to the one place Jorik's influence can't reach, the off-world enclaves. But that's a near impossible jump from a planetary locked sector like this." He finally brought the shuttle to a halt in a vast, cavernous space that smelled of damp metal and decay. The remains of ancient train tracks crisscrossed the floor, disappearing into black, gaping tunnels. He powered down the shuttle, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. For a long moment, they both just sat there, the adrenaline of the escape slowly draining away, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The events of the night felt unreal, a fever dream. The cool, quiet order of their lives had been shattered, and they were now fugitives in the ruins of a forgotten world. Kalen finally slumped back in his seat, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time. He let out a long, shuddering breath. He turned to Elian, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the control panel. The anger was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. "When you went out that window," he began, his voice low and unsteady, "the bond. It felt like I was falling with you. I felt everything." He shook his head as if trying to clear it. "My conditioning is supposed to make me prioritize the mission, the objective, the greater good of the consortium. I should have let you fall. I should have prioritized the retrieval of the ledger and my own escape." He looked at Elian, his gray eyes searching, lost. "But I didn't. The only thought in my head was that I could not let you die. Every protocol, every piece of my training screamed at me to let you go. And I couldn't." Elian looked at the man beside him, the alpha who had been his jailer, his warden, and now his co-conspirator. The man who had just confessed that he had broken the core tenet of his entire existence for him. The bond between them was no longer a cold, clinical connection. It was humming with a shared terror, a shared relief, and something else, something warm and tentative and terrifyingly new. "Maybe," Elian said softly, "your training was wrong." Kalen stared at him, and in the dim light of the abandoned subway, a profound and irreversible truth passed between them. The accidental bond had been a prison. The escape had been a gamble. But what they had now, sitting together in the darkness, hunted and alone, felt for the first time like a choice. Elian reached out, his hand covering Kalen's on the control panel. He didn't flinch. He turned his hand over, his fingers lacing with Elian's. His grip was firm, grounding, a silent promise in the dark. They were no longer prefect and asset. They were just Kalen and Elian, two broken pieces of a corrupt system who had found an anchor in each other. They had no plan. They had no allies. The most powerful forces in their world were hunting them, but as he sat there, holding the Alpha's hand, the scent of vetiver and stone mingling with his own scent of ozone and rain, Elian did not feel afraid. He felt a quiet, defiant hope. The cage was broken, and they were flying, together, into an unknown sky. They spent 3 cycles in the subterranean darkness, the abandoned nexus their sanctuary and their prison. The shuttle's power was kept at a minimum, just enough to run life support and a passive scanner. Kalen worked relentlessly, cannibalizing parts of the shuttle's comm system, trying to jury-rig a device that could bypass the sector's planetary lockdown protocols. Elian, meanwhile, painstakingly digitized the contents of Jorik's ledger using a small, handheld scanner. The book was a testament to a breathtaking level of corruption, detailing not just the weaponized suppressant project, but also illegal arms deals, political assassinations, and a network of blackmail that reached into the highest echelons of the consortium. Jorik was not just a symptom of the system's sickness, he was a nexus of its deepest rot. The forced proximity in the shuttle's cramped cabin changed the very nature of their bond. There were no more walls to hide behind, no more protocols to enforce distance. They moved around each other with a quiet, unconscious grace, a physical awareness that went beyond simple proximity. Elian would wake from a nightmare and find Kalen watching over him, his face etched with concern. Kalen would work until he was ready to collapse from exhaustion, and Elian would press a nutrient pack into his hand, a silent command to rest. They spoke little, but the silence was no longer a weapon. It was a shared space filled with a deep, burgeoning understanding. The bond itself was transforming. It was less a conduit for sharp, intrusive emotions and more a constant, steady hum of mutual presence. It was a quiet awareness of the other's state of being, the tension in Kalen's shoulders as he worked on a particularly complex circuit, the flicker of sorrow in Elian's heart as he read another name in the ledger. It was an intimacy that was both profound and unnerving. On the 3rd cycle, Elian was finishing the final page of the ledger when he felt a sudden, sharp spike of pain from Kalen. He looked up. The Alpha was hunched over the control panel, his body rigid, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A fine sheen of sweat covered his forehead. "Kalen," Elian said, rushing to his side. "It's nothing," Kalen gritted out, but his hand was pressed against his side, and Elian could see a dark stain spreading on his uniform. He gently pushed Kalen's hand away, a deep, ugly gash, hastily sealed after their escape, had torn open. It was inflamed, infected. In the chaos of the flight, Kalen had ignored his own injuries. "You're hurt," Elian said, his voice sharp with alarm. "The shuttle's med kit is nearly empty." "It's a minor wound," Kalen insisted, trying to push him away, but his movements were weak. "The comms array is more important." "It's not minor, it's infected," Elian countered, his own medical knowledge, gleaned from years of self-maintenance, kicking in. "If it goes septic, you'll die down here." He rummaged through the depleted medkit, his hands shaking slightly. There was 1 dose of a powerful, broad-spectrum antibiotic left and a few sterile bandages. Not enough. He needed more. He needed proper supplies. He looked at Kalen, who was now leaning heavily against the console. his face pale in the dim light. The Alpha, who had always been the paragon of control, of unyielding strength, was vulnerable. He needed him. The realization settled in Elian's chest with a heavy, aching weight. Their survival was not just linked, it was completely, terrifyingly interdependent. "I have to go out," Elian said, his voice firm. Kalen's head snapped up. "No, it's too dangerous. Yorick will have patrols everywhere. They'll be looking for any sign of us." "They will be looking for two people," Elian argued. "A prefect and his Omega asset. They won't be looking for a lone scavenger in the underlevels. There's a black market clinic 2 sectors over. I remember its location from my time in the reclamation yards. I can get the supplies we need." "I forbid it," Kalen said, trying to rise to assert his authority, but a wave of dizziness sent him stumbling back into his seat. The effort cost him, and a low groan of pain escaped his lips. Elian placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are not a prefect anymore," he said softly, "and I am not your asset. We are partners. And right now your partner is telling you that you are a liability, and I need to fix you." He allowed a small wry smile to touch his lips. "Consider it an order." The look on Kalen's face was a mixture of frustration, fear, and a grudging, reluctant respect. He was not used to being cared for. He was not used to being told what to do, but he was also a pragmatist. He knew Elian was right. He finally gave a shallow, defeated nod. "There's a maintenance uniform in the back locker. It has a lower-level worker's ID." He met Elian's gaze, his own filled with a desperate plea. "1 hour, Elian, no more. If you are not back, I am coming for you, infection or not." 1 hour, Elian promised. The underlevels were a different world, a grimy, forgotten underbelly to the pristine city above. The air was thick with the smell of unrecycled waste and chemical runoff. People moved through the shadows, their faces hard, their eyes suspicious. Here the consortium's control was a distant abstract concept. The only law was survival. Elian, in his stained maintenance uniform, his face smudged with grease from the shuttle's engine, blended in perfectly. He was a ghost again, but this time he had chosen the role. He found the clinic in a dark, narrow alley, its entrance hidden behind a sheet of corrugated metal. The medic was a grim, wiry woman with cybernetic eyes that whirred softly as they scanned him. He traded the shuttle's emergency water rations and a high-capacity energy cell for a kit of military-grade antibiotics, synth skin applicators, and pain dampeners. It was a fortune on the black market, but the medic didn't ask any questions. In the underlevels, a person's past was their own business. As he was leaving, he saw it. A public view screen flickering in the gloom of a crowded market square. Jorik's face was on it. He had been officially promoted to acting prefect. The broadcast was praising his swift action in neutralizing the traitorous threat of the former prefect Kalen, who it was claimed had suffered a psychological breakdown and attempted to steal state secrets, resulting in the death of his Omega asset. They were already rewriting history. They had been erased. A cold rage filled Elian. He turned to go, but then the image on the screen changed. It was a security recording from the administration tower. It was him running toward the window, but the footage had been altered. It showed him turning, a weapon in his hand, firing at Kalen, who was just entering the room. Then it showed him leaping from the window. It was a lie, a masterfully crafted piece of propaganda that painted him as a violent, unstable Omega who had betrayed his Alpha. It was designed to sow fear, to reinforce the narrative that Omegas were inherently dangerous and needed to be controlled. He felt a surge of pure, unfiltered fury from Kalen through the bond. The Alpha was watching a broadcast somewhere, seeing the same lie. He felt Kalen's pain, his rage at the desecration of Elian's memory, at the perversion of the truth. Elian had to get back. He turned and ran, melting back into the shadows of the alleyways, the precious medical supplies clutched in his hand. He made it back to the Nexus with minutes to spare. He found Kalen not in the shuttle, but standing at the entrance to the tunnel, his hand on the wall to steady himself, a plasma pistol in his other hand. He had been waiting. He had been ready to come after him. The relief on Kalen's face when he saw him was so profound it was almost painful to witness. He sagged against the wall, the pistol clattering to the ground. "You're safe," he breathed, the words heavy with exhaustion. "I told you I would be," Elian said, holding up the medical kit. He helped the weakened Alpha back into the shuttle and immediately set to work cleaning and dressing his wound. Kalen was quiet, submitting to his care with a new, uncharacteristic stillness. "I saw the broadcast," Kalen said finally, his voice rough. "What he did to you, to your name." "It's just a lie," Elian said, his hands gentle as he applied the synth skin. "We have the truth. That's all that matters." "It does matter," Kalen insisted, his hand coming up to cup Elian's cheek. The touch was hesitant, gentle. His thumb stroked the line of his jaw. "He tried to erase you, to turn you into a monster." His gray eyes were filled with a fierce, protective light. "I will not let that stand. I will burn their entire system to the ground before I let that be your legacy." Elian leaned into the touch, his own eyes closing for a brief moment. In that touch, in that promise, the last of his own defenses crumbled. The bond between them flared, no longer a simple connection, but a bright, burning confluence of shared purpose, shared pain, and a deep, unspoken affection that had grown in the darkness. He had gone out to save Kalen's life, but in doing so, he had solidified his place in it. He was no longer just a partner in survival. He was something more. He finished tending to the wound and pulled back, the space between them suddenly charged with a new, palpable tension. The medicated haze was beginning to lift from Kalen's eyes, replaced by a clear, sharp intensity. He looked at Elian, really looked at him, not as a medic, not as an ally, but as the person who had just walked through fire for him. "Elian," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion Elian couldn't name. He reached out, his hand gently tracing the line of the bonding bite on Elian's neck, a mark he had never willingly acknowledged before. His touch was feather-light, reverent. "This was an accident," he said, his gaze locked on the scar. "A malfunction, a consequence of a broken system." He looked up, his eyes meeting Elian's. "It is no longer an accident. It is the only thing that is real." And then slowly, deliberately, he leaned in and pressed his lips to Elian's. The kiss was not one of passion, but of profound, aching tenderness. It was a confession, a surrender. It was the taste of vetiver and stone, of pain and survival, of a hope forged in the heart of a fallen city. It was the sealing of a bond that was no longer accidental but chosen. In the belly of the machine, hunted and alone, they had found their freedom not in escape, but in each other.